Well, hi, everybody. John Elzinga, and welcome back to It's a Great Day to Serve the Lord. And today I want to talk about something kind of unusual, maybe from an unusual angle, we'll put it that way. I want to talk about the serendipity of God, or we could call it the serendipity of God's plan. Serendipity. Interesting word. It's defined by Webster as a phenomenon of finding valuable or agreeable things not sought for. You didn't look for it. You didn't expect it. You didn't anticipate it. This is not something you thought would happen, and it happened. An additional definition would be an aptitude for making desirable discoveries by accident. Or some people would say by coincidence or by chance. You didn't plan it. Again, you didn't expect it. You didn't look for it, and there it is. This happened by chance. We call that serendipity. Some people say it's fate, it's destiny, or it's the universe. And as Christians, we know it's not none of those. That it is God that is orchestrating the events of our life so that we will fulfill His purpose for us. In fact, Psalm 138:8 says, "The Lord will fulfill His purpose for me. Your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. Do not forsake the work of your hands." The Lord will fulfill His purpose for me and for you. The Lord has a purpose for every single person. For every single person listening to me right now, God has a purpose for you, has a plan for you, has something laid out and designed for you. And yet there's so many things that God does in our life that just don't make sense. Things we wouldn't have planned, or certainly not the way we would have planned it. All we have to do is look back to the story of Joseph. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of Joseph. Most people know it. Look in Genesis 35 to 50. It's a great story, a wonderful story, a story of God's serendipity. But through a series of events, God brings Joseph to Egypt to become second in command. This Hebrew, this Israelite, God brings him to Egypt to become second in command. And there's a time that he finds himself, in fact, there in jail. And as I re-looked at this story this past week, I realized that no one would have predicted the outcome that would have happened to Joseph. No one would have planned or thought that throwing Joseph in a pit or selling him to slavery into Egypt was a good idea. No one would have imagined that jail time was a good way to be connected and get connected to the king of Egypt, to the Pharaoh of Egypt. No one would have done that. And yet, in God's serendipity, He uses the unexpected, the unusual, the circuitous routes to get us to where He wants us to go, and ultimately to fulfill His plan for us. What about us? What about if we're struggling and we're experiencing financial loss? Can God use that? I can tell you absolutely, positively He can, because He's used that in our life. We lost everything twice in our life, and God used that in an unusual way. I'll talk about part of it in a minute. What about relational brokenness? There's so much relational brokenness in the world. There's obviously marriage brokenness, divorce. There is relational brokenness between families. There's relational brokenness within companies, within organizations, between organization and organization. There's a lot of brokenness. And yet God can use that as well. God will use that. Acts 17:26 is a curious verse. It says, "For from one man He made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth." And watch this. "He marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." Think about that. God determined when you would be born, to whom you would be born, and where you would be born. And God determined the places that you would live. To some people, God plants them in one place. They live there their whole entire life. To other people, like me, God moves them around, shifts them around, brings them here, brings them there, to be connected or reconnected to people he previously didn't know and those who didn't know him. Connected for a purpose, brings you there for the purpose. You may not know why, you may not understand it, but God does it. In 2011, we had lost everything that we had owned. That's another story, I've told it before. And I was looking for a position that matched, my giftedness, what I did best. And through another circuitous route, I found this place called Pizza Ranch in northwest Iowa. I mean, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the cornfields, in this little bitty town, this company called Pizza Ranch I'd never heard of before. And I'm going there for an interview, and I'm just kind of like torn, and I'm just thinking, Lord, would you really take me 2,000 miles away from the people I love? Would you really? Is this something you really want? I was looking for confirmation, and that day I can see it as if it was yesterday. That day I had my interview, and my soon-to-be boss was walking me around the corporate office. And he stops at this one office and he says, "Hey, John, you got to meet this guy. You guys think alike. You guys talk alike." And he opens the door and he says, "Hey, Perry," the guy's name was Perry. "Hey, Perry, you got to meet this guy. His name's John Elsinga. He comes from Southern California." And Perry says, "Well, where in Southern California?" And I said, "Oh, it's a town just north of San Diego." He said, "What town north of San Diego?" I said, "Oh, you probably never heard of it. It's called Temecula." And he looks me straight in the face and he says, "I'm from Temecula." Not only was he from Temecula, turns out that we had gone to the same church and we didn't know each other. I still get chills when I think about it. Talk about serendipity. Talk about something unusual and unexpected. Talking about a confirmation I would have never thought of. I would have never expected another person in this little bitty town, in this little bitty place, who had come from where I came from. God's confirmation happens in the midst of his serendipitous plans. My friend, I have 4 bits of encouragement for you to discover and ride along with the serendipity of God's plan in your life. Number 1, be aware. Have a heightened sense of awareness of the indicators that God's at work in your life. That you're in the midst of serendipity. It could be a surprise phone call from somebody. In 2006, I had just finished writing and producing my book, Thank God I'm Not a Pharisee, or Am I? And I'd produced a video along with it, and I'd put it out there, and we were advertising it, and I put it on the web and so on. And I had a pastor call me from just south of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he asked me about the book and the topic and what I talked about and so on. And he asked me, hey, can you send it to me by this date? Because I'm preaching on a topic like that. And it just so happened, by coincidence, that I was going to go visit my sister in Grand Rapids that weekend. And so I said to him, I could do one better. I'll hand deliver it to you. About an hour after the phone call, he calls me back and he says, "Hey, John, would you be available to preach on that subject this Sunday?" Serendipity. The unusual. The chance. The improbable. You may have had chance meetings with people. We call them chance. I've met people. I live in Southern California. I met people in New Orleans, downtown New Orleans, in Denver, in airports, at Starbucks, at conferences. I was at one conference many years ago that changed the course of my career because of somebody I met at a conference. Become aware. Have a heightened sense of of awareness that God's at work. Embrace the clues. Now, this isn't a game. But when we know that God is working and orchestrating the events of our life through some kind of serendipitous happening, that we don't know what's happening, we don't know where this is leading, but acknowledge God's doing something. Hey, I don't know what it is. I don't know what God's got planned, but I just feel it. I know God's doing something. Third, always point to God. Always point to God. When you're talking to others about serendipity in your life, about God working in your life. In Genesis 42, in the story of Joseph, Pharaoh of Egypt had some dreams. He brought his wise guys in to interpret the dream. No one could interpret the dream. And his cupbearer, the guy that brings him wine, his cupbearer remembers that when he was in prison, there was this guy by the name of Joseph who could interpret dreams. And he says, hey, go get him. And they bring him. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, tells Joseph his dreams, and he asks him to interpret it. And here's what Joseph says. This guy that was just in prison, this Hebrew, Joseph says to the king of Egypt, I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer. It's not me that's doing it. It's not me that's interpreting it, but God is. He's pointing to God. He's giving God the glory. He's saying this is all about what God is at work in. Serendipity. Ultimately, my friend, it's about trust, isn't it? Trusting what God is doing in the moment, in the midst of this serendipitous stuff, in the midst of this stuff you don't understand, in the midst of the surprises and the challenges and the freaky things maybe that will be happening to you. We trust God. A friend recently reminded me of Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 6, which I'd memorized many years ago. You probably know it. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Trust in what God's doing. Trust in it. Not on your own understanding. You don't understand it. You can't believe what's happening. You don't know why it's happening. You don't know what God is doing. But trust that God is doing something in your life. He is directing you. He is channeling you to a certain place, to a certain group of people, to a certain business, to a certain church, to a certain city, to a certain home, to a certain group of other people that you don't know. Which leads us to the fourth thing. Follow God's direction. You may not know where it's going to end up, but take the next best step. The direction God is pointing to, the serendipitous things that are happening in your life, take that step. Make that move, and you will discover the serendipity of God in your life. That's your devotions for today. Before Thanksgiving, I just want to say happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Thank you for those that have supported this channel. If you'd like to support it, there's a link below. God bless you, and remember, it's a great day to serve the Lord.